All right. Welcome, Jon, to the whole shebang. Thank you so much for being here. It's really an honor to sit down and chat with you today.
Jen, I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit. Let's just start with the work that you're doing now with Exchange. If you could give our listeners just an overview of what it is and maybe what led you to this work or this kind of approach to work.
Yeah, well, honored to share. I think a starting point, Jen, is my deepest curiosity, and our curiosity at Exchange is really centered around what we can learn about how to bring out potential, not only in individuals, but specifically when people come together in different group settings. So I know you're familiar, but it could be a training, a workshop, a meeting that happens inside an organization. And if you stop and think about it, there's so many places where we invest resources, time, people, money, our heads and our hearts in these different group environments. And that's our deepest curiosity. And the way that the learnings materialize is we teach folks from all around the world how to design and facilitate gatherings that hopefully tap into the collective heads and hearts of whoever's come together. So that's on a high level, that's our curiosity.
It's beautiful. I should back up and just share a little bit for the people to know like how we met. So I very serendipitously ended up in one of your courses, Awaken Conscious Leadership. And prior to that, I felt very frustrated and very stuck with a few of the things that I was trying to figure out how to integrate. So one, neuroscience, two, this whole masculine feminine dynamic, and three, leadership. And I was like, how in the world will these things collide? And then my coach, Debbie Frapp, invited me to be a part of this course, Awaken Conscious Leadership. And I don't know how many faces you can see on your screen when you're in the workshop, but I probably cried no less than a dozen times because I was like, oh my gosh, here it is. Like, here is the collision of all of those things. And just a word of gratitude for you and the way that you showed up and led with head and heart. It is maybe the first and most poignant example of that I've seen via Zoom nonetheless. And so it was just really meaningful for me. And talk about unlocking potential. I definitely feel like I am a story of that experience. So thank you personally for the work that you've done. It was such a powerful, transformative experience for me.
Oh, thank you for that, Jen. That means the whole world to hear you share that. And I feel very fortunate, to hear you share that. Even though I'm one of the teachers or facilitators, I mean, I'm, as you're aware, it's a topic like conscious leadership. I don't believe there's such thing as like an ending to that learning. It's a path. We're on it, we're off it. And so I'm as much on the learning journey as I might look like I'm on the teaching journey. And we're very fortunate to meet so many folks like yourself through these teachings.
Yeah. If we could go back a little bit further, I read in your bio that you have some experience in sales previously, but I find it, I'm sure there's a lot that I don't know. I'm curious what your experience was like when you started out in business and you were young and you were like quickly rising to the top in terms of sales, correct?
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. This is not a time for humility, Jon. I know. But I want to hear a little bit about that. And then did you always approach your work and leadership with this lens, or was there a point at which you were like, ooh, we can do something different here?
Yeah, well, maybe I can kind of work backwards and answer your question. But I also want to honor one of the things I love. I told you this a minute ago. I went this morning and I listened to your first episode of this podcast, and I enjoyed it for a lot of reasons, and one of them is your invitation for people to be on this journey to connect with our true selves, and I loved that invitation and our whole selves. So I want to give an answer that reveals the whole story, so to speak.
Right.
prior to founding Exchange, yes, I was an executive at the Vitamix Corporation, where we made very nice high-end blending equipment. And that was a life-changing, career-changing experience for me. I was given a gift of being guided by some incredible women leaders. In fact, Jody Berg at the time was the CEO. She was their CEO for 30 or so years. Her great-grandfather founded Vitamix in 1921. So that's its own fascinating story. But Jody taught me so much that has affected what we're doing today at Exchange. Most notably, this idea that to be a leader today, it's not really about having all the answers. At a different time in history, a leader, a manager was supposed to know everything. Now it's maybe more about how do we invite the collective intelligence and intuition and creativity from as many people as possible. Jody was the first person to kind of invite me into that. But prior to Jody, I had some experiences at a young age where I was successful before I found Vitamix. But what's really interesting, Jen, and I think this is probably the part of the story that you and maybe I might both find more interesting, is my success was largely a result of a period of time in my life that was anything but successful. Between the ages of 6th grade and high school, for a whole assortment of reasons, I was in, primarily because my parents had moved a couple times, I was in something like 4 different schools within 5 years. And what ended up happening during that time in my life is I really struggled. And when I say I really struggled, that might actually be a soft way of explaining it. There was a period of time, particularly in high school, where I struggled not only in school, right? I never went to college because none of the places I applied to accepted me. I eventually figured out how to kind of solve for that. But during that time in my life, I was struggling not only intellectually, but socially, physically, emotionally, mentally, every imaginable way. So much so that, I'm curious about things like the psychology of things today. And it took me 20 years to realize I was so afraid for my safety, for my life. I actually hid inside our school library every single day, anytime I wasn't in class, for more than an entire year in high school. I was afraid to be seen by other people. So I guess the reason I felt like sharing that part of my story is it took me a long time, but I eventually felt like a lot of what we've created at Exchange was in some unconscious way me trying to heal some wounded part of my own soul, so to speak. So there's a few different sides to my story there.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to blank on the name of the book. I just started reading yesterday. I made the mistake. It's How to Know a Person, I think is what it's called. I'll put it in the show notes.
Oh, David Brooks.
Yes. So I made the mistake of turning the Audible on today and to a chapter about compassion and empathy and how to really see somebody and be seen. And just am instantly weeping because there is something so innately human and beautiful about being seen and seeing other people. So when you talk about that period in your life where you were afraid to be seen, and then where you are now, which to me, visible and seen is probably not the same thing, right? But to me, I feel like you're very seen, or you're allowing yourself to be seen by people now, and that's quite a transformation.
I like how you put that. Yeah. That's a wonderful reflection to think about. I love that.
So one of the things that I've been so excited to talk about with you, well, 2 things, conscious leadership and conscious capitalism. I had not heard those phrases until I was introduced to your work at Exchange. And it was so much that I was intuiting, but I was like, oh, there's a whole swath of work out here on this. And you are one of the centerpieces of this work, if I'm understanding correctly. I mean, you just got back from a summit with CEOs on conscious capitalism and conscious leadership. And so I would love to dive into that and hear you unfold a little bit. Maybe we can start first with conscious leadership, what it is,
Sure.
What the tenets of it are.
Yeah, well, so conscious leadership, I mean, these are two big words that can mean a lot. They can mean something different to everybody. And I actually think it can be useful to introduce the phrase conscious leadership in the context of conscious capitalism. And I can explain why. Mm-hmm. So you are correct. I literally just got back last week. I have the privileged role and opportunity of getting to support the annual Conscious Capitalism CEO Summit as a designer and the facilitator of the conference. And that is, it's like a dream come true to get to lead a room of leaders of companies that want to purpose, or they already have purposed their companies to elevate humanity through business, which is kind of an essential higher purpose of conscious capitalism. But I think the backstory that helps to answer your questions, for me personally, I came across in, I think it was 2012 or 13, may have been about 10 years ago, this organization. And it's also a set of management principles and tools, and even some embedded in their company as a strategy, called Conscious Capitalism. And I first read the book by that name, which was co-authored by Raj Sisodia, who was originally a professor, a marketing professor, and John Mackey, the founder and longtime CEO of Whole Foods. And what I was learning about for the very first time was that capitalism, first of all, if we look back historically, even just over the last 200 years, a couple hundred years ago, and I'm not going to get these data points spot on, but directionally, what I'm going to say is pretty well documented. Just a few hundred years ago, Jen, the large majority of the world population was illiterate, like 95%. Mm-hmm. That number is like almost inverted today, or something extraordinary. The large majority of the world lived on in today's dollars, less than like $1 or $2 a day. The large majority lived in extreme poverty just in the last couple hundred years. Mm-hmm. And capitalism deserves some important credit for literally pulling humanity out of the dirt. At the same time, I think there are many who have realized that we need to be really thoughtful about the way that we lead, the way that our businesses and our institutions live in our world today. And so this paradoxical name, conscious capitalism, it's a set of philosophies and tenets. And there's 4 tenets. And one of them is for any enterprise or business to connect themselves to the highest possible purpose. The second tenet is about caring about everybody that we interact with, or what they call a stakeholder orientation. The third one is about a conscious culture, which these are my words. And I would say it's a culture where people can be and bring their whole best selves, or discover their whole best selves. That's my paraphrasing. And then the final tenet is conscious leadership, which in the context of conscious capitalism, we need conscious leaders to enable those other 3 tenets to come alive. And Jen, just one other point, as I've gotten to know you, I know that you are interested in not only a holistic perspective, but one that is backed by data. Yeah. There is some very solid data that has come from many different places that validates that these businesses that operate with these types of principles, they also outperform. So we can actually do well in the world and do good. Maybe they actually go together. So I just wanted to give that historical context for anybody who's new to this conscious capitalism concept. And I'll do my best to answer what's conscious leadership. How about in like a sentence? Which it feels, you sat through a 3-day training we ran on it, right?
Go.
How do I do it in a sentence? Well, here's one way, and there's not one way. But let's just consider that leadership is something that's available to all of us as soon as we realize we all have influence at any moment. Leadership is the undeniable influence we have in every interaction, and even when we're not with others, even just the conversations that happen within ourselves. And so if we put a word like conscious right in front of it, let's try and make this kind of simple and practical. For us, conscious leadership is how do we just become more aware of our influence? And, how do we influence from the inside out? If we want to lead well in the world, we've got to start within. What are the practices and tools based in good evidence that can help us to cultivate from within the kind of presence that'll help us to be better in whatever environment we want to be better in? So I'll stop there. That's a lot to chew on, I guess.
It's so much. I have a million things to ask you. Yeah, I think when I think about conscious leadership and awareness, to me, the converse side of that is running on automatic, right? It's I'm going to show up to work, I'm going to show up to life, and I'm going to just go. And maybe it's a little bit more reactive and responsive, but it is not from a place that is inside out. And I think this is just my perspective. I think in our society, I think in a lot of workplaces, that is the way we run. And so I want to illuminate the conversation to help people that may be running on automatic right now and that are like, okay, how do I become a more aware leader, or what does that look like? Like, I've seen you demonstrate that. And for the people who are like, well, how do I connect to a higher purpose at work? How do I lead with more awareness? Can you help break that down for us? What does that look like? Where would a leader start, or what are some things for them to digest with that?
Yeah, I'm really happy to. I'm just making a note of something you said. I enjoy how you put that, like running on automatic or autopilot, so to speak. Yeah, what's interesting, Jen, is you reminded me that we met you at this training that we host twice a year, and it's on conscious leadership, but you might remember the title of the training, we actually call it Awakening Conscious Leadership. And what's really interesting about this word conscious is, if we're looking to make this really useful and practical, kind of like you pointed out, the opposite of being conscious is, well, it's when we're unconscious of how we're behaving or why we're behaving. There's other words that we use that are all synonymous. It's when we're reactive. It's when we are out of control, so to speak. And let me give a disclaimer, and then I'd love to just call myself out here. I can talk about all of this probably with coherence. It doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean that even someone like me is constantly conscious. In fact, one of the great joys of running these trainings is how much I realize that maybe I'm just running this because I need it myself, right? Like I'm a parent, and Adair and I are a blended family. We got 5 kids, and we joke all the time, like, as soon as we think we're enlightened, all we need to do is spend a few minutes with our kids.
Life will have a way of humbling us, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, your question, I'll bring this from kind of the sky to the streets for a second. And, I would encourage any of us to stop and just think for a moment about, in our own lives or in our own work. And you could think of this in the most personal way. You could also think about this in the broadest context of this time that we're living in our world. We're living in a time where, as one of our teachers years ago described, the world seems to be changing faster than humans seem to be equipped to adapt to this change. And I can just speak for myself. I've been through actually many challenges that, as I heard about your journey, I can relate with. When I think about just my own adversities that I've dealt with, even in just the last 2 or 3 years, I have had levels of stress that I've never had before. In fact, I've had times where I was really stressed out about how stressed out I was. And you and I can smile at that, but anyone who's listening knows that those are very difficult moments. And that stress and that it comes with doubt, self-doubt, and ultimately the neurological answer to what happens when we're under pressure is we get reactive, we get unconscious, we operate from a place within us. And anyone can relate to this when we think about moments when we're not at our best. I think about when I go home every night and I'm around my kids, and stress is a result of demands exceeding resources, right? Just to give a textbook answer. But how does that materialize, and what can we learn, and what can we do about it? Well, at the end of the day, I'm tired. I'm under-resourced. And everything I know I should do and who I should be, it's not always who shows up. And I'll reactively say or do something, even if I have good intentions. And a good question for me to ask is, when is my reaction causing more harm than good? Not all reactivity is bad. But when is inside of my relationships and my conversations? And I find, Jen, the greatest tool, the greatest mirror for my own learning is looking at my most personal relationships, and especially the ones that challenge me the most. Usually I find, whether it's my kids or someone I work with, that if I pay close enough attention, if I can notice these moments when I get triggered by something, I've eventually discovered that, first of all, that's happening all the time. And secondly, it probably means I'm bumping up against a new edge of growth for me. It probably means I'm bumping up against something that I've not fully healed or resolved within myself. And so the good news is I keep getting triggered. There's more for me to learn. All right.
It's great news. I love this. On a practical level, thank you for sharing and being so transparent, by the way. I think it goes to show that we are all so human, no matter our background or our position, our experience, or what we are. And so for me to hear you say, yeah, I have these moments of self-doubt, or I've had more stress than I've had before, and I've been under-resourced. What do you do during those times that you're feeling a lack of resource or a lack of belief, or how do you work through that?
Yeah. So it's the question of all questions. And I try and turn to any one of a variety of different tools. We refer to these as practices. And, I've, in the last number of years, realized that if I want to dig my way out of these difficult moments, there's a lot of work that I ought to commit to doing every single day, so that when I'm in these moments, it can be a little bit easier to find the ability within. So for me, the tools or the practices, and as you know, the way we teach these, there are certain tools that are what I would call from the neck up. And neck up tools, and we need all these types of tools, I think, are, it's another way of saying, I could have a conversation with myself about what's going on. And sometimes for some of us, that can be really useful. For example, if I have practiced asking certain questions with enough repetition, then in the heat of a difficult moment, I might be able to remember to consciously go to one of these questions. And one could be, I'll just jump right into the deep end. When things are most difficult, I try and remember to ask myself, how might this be happening? Maybe not so much to me, but instead for me. And, in some moments, I don't want to hear that question. The other little voice will say, fuck off. But I've learned over time that if I'm willing to open myself to listening, that eventually an answer might arise to that. Or here's another example of just changing the question, which can change the story. And this I learned from Kelly McGonigal, who's one of the great researchers out of Stanford on stress. She teaches that for many people, they can immediately reframe a very difficult moment by changing the question from unconsciously, how do I get through this or deal with this, to how do I remind myself that this stress just means something I care about is at stake? There's an interesting flavor in that question, isn't there? It actually brings a tone of like self-compassion, which I think is always important. So I said these are neck up, internal dialogue tools. But then there's neck down stuff, which is understanding the power of our breath. And I try every single day to practice breath work and different meditative practices. And I've noticed that the breath can be a real savior in difficult moments. But hopefully I've cultivated that muscle before I get to those moments.
Yeah. I'm going to take a little bit of a left. It's not total left turn. I'm going to meander down this path. Do you want to go there with me?
I love that. I love that. That's great.
I recently was leading a class on happiness and hustle and noticed that there was a 5-to-1 ratio of women to men that showed up. And one of the things that I appreciate is that you're not shying away from the sort of the work or the inner work and the conversation around it and talking about things like breath work. And I'm not going to probably say this in the wrong way, so just forgive me, but like, you're a masculine man and you're showing up and you're grounded and you're leading with clarity and you're having a lot of success in your business. And so I put a thing on Facebook that was like, hey, why aren't more men into personal growth and development? Which illuminated some of my biases out of the gate, right? I just hadn't asked enough questions. Well, I got feedback from one gentleman in one of my organizations that was like, well, because I perceive that like you're just speaking to women. And I was like, no, I'm missing the mark somehow. But then kind of what came out more as the conversation went on is that, or this is what my perception is that there are a good amount of men, just like there are women, that are leaning into this work and personal growth and development, but they seem to feel like there's either less space or less safe space to talk about it in a public way. And I don't know if that's just like the chamber that I'm in, but I'm really curious just to hear maybe your experience as a man in leadership and doing this work, or maybe your personal experience, just kind of your thoughts on all of that.
Oh my gosh. Well, there's so many things that come up for me. I've spent a good amount of time working with both men's groups and women's groups. I've worked for several years with Women Presidents Organization. They're an incredible membership of many of the great women leaders, business leaders in the world. And we worked with their chapter chairs as they navigated through the first couple of years of the pandemic. So I've been in a lot of rooms where it's just men and just women. And I think what you're perceiving, the way I'm going to choose to receive it, is you may be perceiving that it can feel more or less likely for men to be interested in doing certain types of work or being in certain conversations. And what I have seen is that there are places and spaces where there are men doing incredible, deep inner work. And I've seen rooms where women are invited, but it's still mostly men, and that could be for a whole assortment of reasons. I've also seen women's groups where I can tell that inner work is not making its way into the room, but because those women had to overplay their masculine for so many generations. So I've actually seen the opposite play out. And I think there's kind of a broader context and then an invitation for all of us. The broader context is just the willingness to recognize that, we're living at maybe the end of, and who knows, I mean, there's prophecies and predictions and data, but hundreds of years where, as one of my deep, soulful mentors, Lynn Twist, has taught me, and there's a prophecy that's told, and I wish I could cite the origins of it, but Lynn shares with me how the bird of humanity has flown for so many years with the wing of the feminine tied behind its back. And the result of that is the masculine had to work really hard. Any strength overplayed brings out shadows. I know you're interested in polarities. That's what happens if we're not mindful individually and collectively, right? And so I think a lot of the challenges we see in our world, we can trace that to what happens when there's this overplaying of the masculine. And so there are many who believe, hope, wish for, perceive that this is a time where if that feminine can rise up, there's more wholeness. So I think a willingness to see that really has played out is one reason why it could be that men or women have not been open to these conversations that you're hosting that invite the whole self. because we're part of a broader system that has stifled that. But I was thrilled to be here today because you're serving as a warrior for the whole human spirit right now. And
Yeah.
so
Ooh,
that's
you
one way of answering
so
that.
much for that perspective. Thank you for that perspective. That's really, I don't feel like that'll be healing for me too, just to contemplate that a little bit. And it is interesting. The more conversations I'm having and the more I'm diving into this, even the polarity side, I'm like, oh, this idea that as a strong, independent woman, I feel like my emotions have been too much. That is not unique to women. Like I do think that more and more of this, it's not gender specific at all. It is more societal. And so I really appreciate what you shared about what Lynn was saying, that the wing of the feminine has been clipped behind our backs. Ooh, yeah, I feel that. And how powerful is it that we can be a part of unclipping? I don't know how to change that into a verb. Flying.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for meandering with me. That was fun.
I love meandering. You can ask anyone who works with me. I'm quite skilled at
You're game for that. Okay, great. Okay, so I would love to come back to the summit that you just came back from. I have a few questions about that. So you touch on a little bit what it is. I would love to hear just from a leadership standpoint. So you designed and facilitated this whole summit for CEOs of conscious capitalism. I'm curious, as you were designing it, what your objectives were, what you were shaping, what you were looking to create in that experience. So maybe what is it? And then that question.
Yeah. So I think first what I'd love to honor is that, conscious capitalism as a movement, as a community, as a philosophy has been around since long before I was doing anything I'm doing. And this was the 15th year they've hosted their annual CEO summit. So I was given the gift 2 years ago. This is the second year we were invited, and they just asked us to come back again next year and to come in and support this summit. And so there's an incredible team. There's a board of directors. It's already in place. And, the role that I and our team got to play is as thinking partners. How do we help this summit to be a more conscious way of gathering, right? To use a play on words, but in all sincerity, there are so many gatherings in the name of learning, in the name of this is a room full of leaders, and our interest at Exchange and conscious capitalism shares in this interest. It's why we form this beautiful partnership. Is when we fill a room with human beings, let's recognize that the wisdom in the room, the collective intelligence, it's a real thing. Yeah. But how many of us have attended so many gatherings, in person and online, where we walk away and in our heart of hearts, we know that we didn't tap into that collective wisdom. And so, the practical expression of our work is when Abby, who's the vice president of programming, an extraordinary leader herself, brought us in and we started designing and tinkering with the summit. The kinds of questions we asked were, okay, because they already have incredible speakers that come in. And so the questions that we asked are, okay, how do we, number one, design professionally guided moments during the summit where we lead a conversation in the room, even if we only have a minute or two, sometimes we have an hour, about what's being shared from the stage. Which, when you start to look at what does that actually accomplish, what it does is in a superficial way, it moves the moment from passive to interactive, which is great, but it moves the learning to a place that's a lot deeper. And it ultimately moves the learning from the stage to the audience, where the learners become the teachers. So when we're supporting a summit like this with a room of incredible people in the audience and incredible teachers on the stage, we're looking at how do we shift the mixture so that we're not spending the majority of the time listening to great teachers and great teachings, but we're balancing it with conversations that happen in the room that are designed and guided with different questions to contemplate our purpose, to contemplate the lessons we've learned, to contemplate the futures that we want to create. And how do we do it in a way that honors the whole person too? So we're not only facilitating conversations, but we're bringing moments of play. We're bringing even dancing into the room for those who want to go in that direction. We bring meditation and breathing to connect to that deeper place of presence so that whatever else we're doing, we can get or give more out of it or to it. So that's what comes up.
That's great. I think from my experience too, this maybe goes without saying, but one of the huge, I don't know if benefits is the right word, but just the connection that you experience with other humans, and maybe coming a little bit full circle to that idea again of being seen and seeing others. And it's such a theme to me because I think we are so disconnected in general as humans. And so it's so powerful to create and design and choreograph space for all of the things you mentioned and that connection that, I mean, I am connected with you now beyond that one experience because there was room for connection, which is so powerful. So I just wanted to add that. I'm really grateful for that dynamic that exists in those spaces. So
yeah, and I'd love to build on what you're saying because there's a biology that underlies what we do. There's also a business case that underlies what we do. And even if the reason everybody has come into this room is so we can learn, which is a very intellectual reason to come to the room, and it's a good reason to come into the room, right? We got to be able to transform our knowledge and our thinking, so that we can be more creative and solve problems and create new possibilities, right? Even if that's why we're in the room, what we've stumbled into, Jen, and you've seen how we do this even online, which is totally wild. I never would have thought it would have been that possible. But what we've stumbled into is the realization that every time a group comes together, there's three sources of what we call capital: intellectual, social, and communal capital. And many people come into the room for the first two, ideas, or maybe I want to meet others. But there's this underlying, even invisible source of value that's rarely why someone might show up, but it's often the biggest reason they'll come back. And anybody in any business, whether you're a trainer, coach, you host conferences, you run meetings, or you want to create a healthy culture, understands that when I say this is why people want to come back, there's a really strong business case for this, right? And here's the fundamental lesson. Every one of us, this speaks to your point about being seen, every single one of us is asking some version of a question every time we gather. Two or more of us come together. And the question is something along the lines of, can I be me and still be a part of whoever this group is? Can I be me and still fit in? However you want to name that, right? And there's a neurological reason why we've asked that question. It's to stay alive, right? The interesting thing is the fastest way for people to feel that sense of psychological safety is not by listening to somebody say something from a stage. It's actually by having an intimate interaction, maybe in a small group or with one other person. So what we've stumbled into is the realization that the sooner we get intentional about choreographing and then facilitating all these different types of interactions in the room, it actually helps people to get to that part of their brain where they can be in the most learningful state possible so we can get a better return on all the knowledge that's coming in and out of the room. So there's a business case and a biology for this whole idea of helping people to feel seen.
I love that so much. And that's where the unlocking the potential comes from, right? I mean, the sooner we can answer the question with, yes, I can be myself and be accepted and get out of limbic brain, the sooner we can get into creativity and connection. And I hadn't heard that term, communal capital. And as you were saying that, I was thinking, again, maybe this is just the arenas I'm in, but I feel like sometimes when I facilitate trainings and I'm like, okay, guys, we're going to get into group real quick. I'm ready to create some communal, and people are like, ooh, please don't make me do it. And then when the time is done, people don't want to leave. And I don't know. So I usually spring that on people because I want them to show up and then experience it and walk away going, wow, that was really powerful. We unlocked potential. We felt seen. We felt safe. We were able to get creative. And I don't want to leave now, which is really powerful. But it is kind of a stumbling into it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's recognizing the difference between what people say they want and what they might really need. And, you know, when we talk about belonging or building community, I think these are words that have gained a lot of traction in the last few years. And yet what I notice is that there are many organizations that are starting to use these words more often. Say, we need to build community. We need people to connect meaningfully. They're saying it. But what I'm sensing is there's still not a widespread awareness that this is meeting one of the most fundamental human biological needs of our time right now. And, you know, many of our teachers and mentors here at Exchange, you mentioned David Brooks, who wrote How to Know a Person. He's a mentor of ours, and I had a series of conversations with him when he was doing research for that book. He came to our community. He did this whole exclusive...
Of course he did.
Yeah, he did a whole exclusive interview with us about his research like 2 years ago, coming into that book. And, you know, one of the things that David's work points to, and so many of our teachers here at Exchange, who are mentors who've come and visited our members, from Meg Wheatley, who's one of the great systems scientists and leadership teachers of our generation, or you look at Peter Zenge or Dana Zohar. These are all folks who both teach about the science of systems, and they also, in the latter part of their careers, have become spiritual teachers. It's interesting. Well, at least that's my perception.
Yeah.
It seems that they've seen the intersection, and one of the lessons that we've learned, and there's a deep, deep basis for this observation, is that whenever something is broken between people or in a group or in an organization or in a culture or a society, the fastest pathway is to strengthen the connections between the parts of that system. In other words, whatever the problem, community is the answer. And people might not realize that intellectually, but as you pointed out, once we experience it, we realize how healthy it feels.
I love this so much. This is just like filling me up. One of the things you said about the difference between what people want and what they need, and I think that's such a poignant thing about leadership. When you're in a position, I don't know if that's a gift or if it's just you see enough patterns over time, but you can look at the community or the group of fractured people that isn't really communal and go, okay, they're saying they want this, but I see that they need this, and I'm going to guide them into that and watch what happens from that. But I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but it just was kind of dawning on me as you were saying that I just think it's such a integral part of leadership, is being able to discern. We don't just do what people want. It's not just give them what they want. It's discern what they need, and then how do I get them there?
Yeah, it's a very interesting conversation topic. I think, you know, what comes up for me is, I really think that the way we think about leading and leadership it's definitely long overdue to be kind of reimagined. And, you know, I think this question of what's the difference between what we want and what we need, I think an interesting way to come into this is the realization that many people still believe that what we need is a few people who have all the answers to tell the rest of us what to do. It's kind of like Henry Ford is always quoted. Who knows if he ever said it, right? But he's always cited as saying, if I would have asked my customers, they would have said, give me faster horses. Yeah. Right? And what's interesting is, in our world, our domain is how we gather, which if you stop and think about it, if you were to say gathering is an industry, it's the largest. It's how we spend the most time. It's where we invest the most of our heads and hearts and dollars, is in these gatherings of 2 or more people. So we just want to give some reverence to how important this is. When we come together, I think one example of understanding the difference between what people want or expect or believe, and yet how maybe what we need is something different, is what we are seeing. Like, let's take this CEO summit, is that we no longer need, in a room full of leaders, to design and lead these gatherings in a way where we're saying a few people are going to give the rest of us the answers. What we really need is a different type of leader, is a leader who's willing to not just be the sage on the stage, but to also transition to being the guide on the side. That's willing to ask questions instead of it being all about what do I know and what can I tell you and how can I control. Control's an illusion in most cases anyways. How can I ask? How can I invite? How can I unlock ideas and perspectives from as many people as possible? That's just a good example of a shift that people might not be aware of until they witness it, and then they realize how meaningful and valuable that can be, to lead differently by being the guide on the side, which, as you know, that's the center of what we teach to folks that come through our trainings.
On the topic of those leaders, and maybe whether it's the summit or other leaders that you've worked with or seen coming off of that, what are some of the themes that you see in those leaders, characteristics, or what did you see and experience?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I have kind of a privileged opportunity in that I get to lead so many groups of leaders, and oftentimes I do feel like I'm the dumbest person in the room, at least in certain domains, and I love that. It's really cool. I think there's a few kind of common threads that in different environments where we're leading leaders of the largest or many of the most well-known or purpose-driven companies in the world, one of the common threads is a widespread recognition that our world is heading in a direction that is truly unpredictable and not something that we necessarily can control. And so that invites some deeper contemplation amongst leaders. And there's a historical basis for these types of comments. A lot of folks listening to this could go, Jon, you didn't need to tell me anything. I can look around right now and see that we're in a very precarious place in our world. And one common thread is I'm seeing a recognition more and more and more that things might actually get more difficult before they get better. And so, as one of our teachers, Meg Wheatley, often has reminded us to consider, at a time like this, and history has repeated itself, at times like this, there are always a select group of people who arise and are what she calls warriors for the human spirit, who they do what is needed. They do what is right, not because they will be able to change the course of the world, but because it is needed and it's what's right. And I'm seeing a lot of leaders recognizing the need for deeper introspection around who are we choosing to be, which happens to also be the title of Meg's most recent book. That's one thread, one common thread. Another thread, and I want to quote Tulane Montgomery. She was one of the attendees and also contributed in a panel at the Conscious Capitalism CEO Summit. Tulane is a futurist. She is a strategist. She's a systems thinker. She's also quite funny. She's a humorist, I think. That's the word. And but Tulane, she's the CEO of an organization called New Profit. I hope I got that name correct, because I just met her for the first time. But one of the things she talked about is the need for what she calls intentional community. And even just at this CEO summit, there were multiple times on stage where leaders of very well-known organizations talked about how we need to invite the kinds of cultures or communities where we can have very difficult conversations. You talk about polarities. What we are seeing is a recognition amongst leaders that we need to be willing to not only give people the freedom to express, but also to be willing to stand in the tension of these differing perspectives. Because when there's tension between people, there's a lot of tension in our world. The unconscious response is often, well, how do I relieve that tension? Which often is by walking away from the conversation or finding others who share the same perspective so that we don't have to be in that tension. But in that dynamic tension is an energy where something amazing could come out of it. And leaders need to be willing to host spaces where this dynamic tension can be honored. And that starts within ourselves. Like, am I willing to be in a conversation where I can genuinely listen to and be curious about somebody who sees something completely the opposite as I do? That's a common trend, a common thread I see that leaders are more and more asking for, calling for. I'll just stop at that.
That's so beautiful. As you were speaking about that, I was thinking, and this is where the inner work is so important, because I cannot imagine being able to hold space for that tension or be present and aware and open, like really open to the conversation if I am not resourced, if I am reactive, if I'm feeling defensive of my perspective in any way. And just speaking from my own experience, it takes time and practice to get to a place where you can show up to a space that has tension in it and actually appreciate it and hold the space for it is, it's so powerful. It's so powerful when you experience that, but not easy to arrive at that place, I think.
I'm still working on it myself.
Yeah. Some things are more triggering than others. I'll just say that. Yeah. And I love how you put it too. I don't know if it was in Shakti leadership, but she talks about that polarity, that when anytime that we have that resistance between two things, if you have, a magnet and the two poles, it is in the space between the poles where the power lies. It is in between the polarities that there's electricity moving that is getting ready to birth something beautiful. And so when we can show up with that perspective of appreciating and welcoming even the tension, knowing that it can result in something really powerful, instead of just like, well, how do we just choose to disagree here? It's like, oh no, there's some power here. I think one of the hardest things to do, Jen, is to listen to this conversation and then go be in a conversation with someone where I feel like I'm given a good effort to be non-reactive, but there's an awareness that I have that this other person either doesn't have an interest or they don't have the tools in being non-reactive. And it can be demoralizing to be in relationships at work or at home or in our communities with anybody where the feeling we have is that they are not making an effort. And that's when I think for all of us, we have to remind ourselves, let's do what we're going to do because it feels right, not because we can control or change other people. If we really want to change other people, I don't know. I think the best way to do it is probably just through who we choose to be. Yeah. And maybe one day our influence could rub off, but that's where it gets difficult for me, at least. I agree with that. I appreciate that wisdom there because, on a practical level, how do we walk that out when we're in those situations? And that sentiment of doing what's right is powerful. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
We're nearing our time. I have just two more questions for you.
All right.
kind of open-ended. I would just love to hear, as we wrap up our conversation together, in Awakening Conscious Leadership, Dr. Danny Friedland shared this question that he was asking of himself or of his life, which is what matters most right now. And so I'd like to ask you that question. What matters most for you right now?
Well, goodness. Well, what matters most, since you named Dr. Danny, I'm so glad that you did. Dr. Danny, as you know, was an incredible mentor to me. It still is. Was an amazing friend, was a student of our work. And then he lost his battle to cancer in October 2021. But where he succeeded wildly is in leaving a big legacy that is still affecting many of us every single day. And so, Danny left behind his wife, Sue, and his two boys, Zach and Dill, and also some beautiful lessons in that question, what matters most? I think for me, what matters most is to remember that all the ups and downs and the challenges and the opportunities at work and at home can be a distraction from what is most essential, which is to do my best as often as I can to remember to do it with love. And love for who I'm with, love for what I'm doing, love for the gifts within the really difficult struggles, and love for myself. And that all sounds really nice. Sounds like something you could put on a mug. But I'm saying
or a
this.
Pillow.
Yeah, I'm saying this to myself, for myself, because life is not easy. Mm-hmm. And, that was actually, since you brought up Danny, one of the messages that he shared in his final weeks and days to his boys. He had this whole series of YouTube videos anybody could go watch. And he put these out in the open. And he shared a message with his boys of all his videos. Some of them were hours long, he and I and others having conversations about life. And there was one that was like 90 seconds long. And it was to his boys, Zach and Dill. And he said, Zach, Dill, hey, I just want you to remember, what gives me love in my heart is for you to live a loving life, love for each other, love for the planet, for life itself. And so since you invoked Danny, I'm allowing his teaching to inform my answer. That's what matters most right now.
I love in all the facets, and so appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Okay, lastly, how do people connect with you? If they'd like to get more information about Exchange or your work, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, you can probably find me in many of the places where you could find people online, LinkedIn, Facebook,
you can Google
I guess.
my name.
You can go, yeah. This is where my team's like, Jon, you got to get your marketing shit together here. I'm like, what website do I give out? X Change Approach. The letter X, the word change, approach.com is our website. And if somebody wants to connect, we run these immersion trainings teaching folks how to design and facilitate group experiences that unlock collective potential. And we're honored. We've had several thousand people come through these trainings just since the pandemic got here. Mm-hmm. And then there's once in a while, Jen, I host personally a live experiential introduction to our work. So if someone's listening, I'd love to meet you. Come meet me. I do these about once a month online. And that's kind of a cool way to see what we're all about. I'm sure there's some other things on our website people could download or check out, but xchangeapproach.com. Would love to meet anyone who heard this conversation. And the code word, if somebody listened this far, is avocado. That's how I will know that you listened this far into this conversation.
That's fantastic. I'll put the website in the show notes. So Thank you so much, Jon, for being here and for sharing your wisdom and transparency and for following the nudges and the guidance that's been put in front of you. It's a blessing to so many. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Jen. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.